shiny Pokemon. Despite being functionally the same as any other Pokemon, some people are obsessed with them and will go to great lengths to find them. They're a status symbol, representing either your dedication to hunting them or your luck for finding one by chance. But how rare are they? When they first debuted in Generation 2, your chance of finding a shiny Pokemon was only 1 in 8,192, but since the release of X and Y, that base chance has been doubled to around 1 in 4,096, and there are also many ways to improve those odds by hunting with certain methods. So what is the rarest shiny, hypothetically? Assuming you have access to every game and choose the method with the best odds, some Pokemon are way easier to hunt than others. And by working backwards, I think I can rank every shiny from the most common up to the hardest of all hunts. And that's what I'm going to do. I originally made this video right before Scarlet and Violet released, covering everything from Generation 2 up to Generation 8, and since then I've had a few requests asking me to update it with all the new Pokemon released in Generation 9. And now with the Indigo Disk DLC finally released, I think it's time for me to tackle this again. Scarlet and Violet introduced a few new ways of finding shinies, and a large number of Pokemon previously excluded from Generation 8 have now returned, meaning many Pokemon from the previous video are now going to be much easier to hunt. Like the last video, I'm going to assume you're hunting for a shiny by any means necessary, and sorting them into tiers based on best possible odds per encounter. All calculations will be including the shiny charm where applicable, as well as any other boosts that would increase the shiny chance. It's worth noting that the shiny charm didn't exist until Black and White 2, and since Sword and Shield there have been a few cases where the shiny charm doesn't actually increase your odds. I'll also be providing odds in the form of fractions this time instead of percentages based on feedback from the last video. If you can find the base form of a Pokemon from one method, its evolutions will be included too, as long as it's possible to evolve it. For example, while you can't find a Metagross in the Dynamax lair, you could find a Metang and then evolve it. This will also apply for cross-generational evolutions, and some Pokemon that can evolve into different regional forms in different games. Lastly, I also won't be talking about Pokemon Go. The availability of certain Pokemon and the rate at which shinies can be found is highly variable, and while I could find all the cases where Pokemon have had increased shiny odds through raids, community days, research days and other events, that information would be largely useless for anyone actually wanting to hunt for them, since all of those events have already ended and there's no telling if or when they will ever be run again. For the same reason, I also won't be covering any Pokemon or shiny odds that have limited availability, such as the boosted shiny outbreaks that were available just before the release of Indigo Disk, or the wild area events from Sword and Shield. Starting off, let's go over all of the exceptions. Here we have all the Pokemon that have never been available as shinies. While many Pokemon can be shiny hunted, certain encounters are shiny locked, meaning that the game will never spawn them as a shiny. This mechanic has existed as far back as Generation 3 in Gale of Darkness, and there have been shiny locked encounters in the main series of games since Black and White. Annoyingly, there's never any indication in-game that tells you whether or not a Pokemon is shiny locked, and to start with, this was only applied to certain legendary and mythical Pokemon. But since Sword and Shield, the shiny lock has been extended to cover any Pokemon that are gifted to you, even including the choice of starter Pokemon. Many shiny locked Pokemon have been made available as shinies in later generations or released as event gifts, but as of right now, these are the ones that are impossible to get as shiny without hacking. One immediate change from the last time I did this list is Fancy Pattern Vivillon. This was originally an event-exclusive form that was only available from a 3-week distribution for X and Y back in 2014. But any Vivillon found in Scarlet and Violet will now have this pattern by default, meaning it can now be shiny hunted. However, the Pokeball pattern remains an event-exclusive form that cannot be shiny. Another set of shiny locked forms are the Pikachu wearing Ash's hats, but due to an error, the partner cat Pikachu can be shiny. This gift can be soft reset with 1 in 4,096 shiny odds in Generation 7, but since it was supposed to be shiny locked, it actually doesn't have a unique shiny colour. You will still see the shiny sparkle, but it is otherwise completely identical to the normal colour of Pikachu. Moving on, here we have all the ones that have only ever been distributed as events or can't otherwise be shiny hunted normally. Mew, Deoxys, Darkrai and Shaymin can be shiny hunted like normal in certain games, but only in areas accessed by limited time events. If you happen to have a save file with the old C-map, the member card, Oak's letter or the Aurora ticket, these 4 mythicals can be hunted with the following odds. The most interesting addition to this list is Gimmighoul, being the only Pokemon in this tier that isn't a legendary, a mythical or an exclusive form. Gimmighoul can be encountered freely across Paldea, but only its chest form can be caught, which are found in fixed locations as static encounters, all of which are shiny locked. Gimmighoul was made available during a raid event for a limited time window, which so far has been the only way to obtain a shiny Gimmighoul or Gholdengo. Meanwhile, Gimmighoul's roaming form is only available to be caught in Pokemon Go, and so far has never been made available as a shiny. Everything else here has been given away as a shiny mystery gift at some point, but is otherwise shiny locked or inaccessible. And just for the sake of completion, here's a quick list of every Pokemon I could find that has ever been given away freely as a shiny.
creations that you thought was dead. No squealing, remember that it's free real estate.
Gyarados is probably the easiest shiny Pokemon of all, since it's a mandatory encounter in Johto. Everyone knows it, and for many people it's the first and possibly only shiny they've ever caught. There are a few more lesser known encounters that are also guaranteed to be shiny. In Black and White 2, if you defeat Benga in Black Tower or White Tree Hollow, you'll be given a shiny Gible in Black 2 or a shiny Dratini in White 2. And once you manage to see every Pokemon in the Univerdex, you can fly to a new area called the Nature Preserve, where a single shiny Haxorus will be waiting for you. This will be the last time they gave out free shinies in-game up until Legends Arceus, where you can find a side quest to encounter a shiny Ponyta. It's easy to miss because you have to check the blackboard to find it, but it's unlocked fairly early into the game's story. Lastly, the Teal Mask and Indigo Disk each include a guaranteed shiny encounter, although you'll have to work hard to earn them. The first one is found in Kitakami. If you can clear the hardest difficulty of Ogre Ousting, you'll be awarded with a shiny Munchlax for your troubles. This Munchlax is also guaranteed to be the largest size possible and comes with the crafty personality mark. But Ogre Ousting on your own gets incredibly difficult, and you might want friends to stand a chance at defeating hard mode. The second shiny can be earned in the Blueberry Academy. After beating the main story, you unlock the ability to call special coaches to the League Club. After you defeat them in a battle and then call them up on 2 more separate occasions, they'll consider you a friend and offer to trade you one of their Pokemon. After befriending all 23 coaches, you unlock the option to battle the secret boss of the Academy, Director Serrano. Defeat him and he will offer to trade you his Blitzel, which, as you might expect, is a fitting shade of blue. This Blitzel is guaranteed to be shiny, but it's far from free. Each time you call up a coach, it costs you 200 Blueberry points, the currency used in the Academy. And since you need to summon each coach 3 times, that's going to cost you a total of 13,800 points to befriend all 23. In Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, you can travel through wormholes to find special encounters, either with legendary Pokemon, Ultra Beasts, or with a small pool of Pokemon that have a very high chance of being shiny. If you travel far enough and jump into the rarest type of wormhole, your chance of finding a shiny will max out at an impressive 36%. The pool of Pokemon found here is very limited though, with only 20 available species, or 22 counting evolutions, but if one of these Pokemon is your favourite, then this is by far the fastest way to hunt them out of any available method. Oh, alright. Going back to Generation 2, in Crystal you can receive an odd egg from the first time you speak with the daycare gentleman. This egg contains a random baby Pokemon which also has a pretty good chance of being a shiny. The overall chance of getting a shiny from this egg is about 14%, but if you want a specific shiny from it, the odds range from about 3% to 1% per hatch depending on what species you're going for. While Pichu and Tyro can also be found from the odd egg, they have the lowest odds of the whole group, and you actually have a slightly higher chance with regular breeding in this generation, provided you have a degree in genetics. Okay, so welcome back to genetics class. Last time I did this it was pretty rambly, kind of unscripted, and took up a much larger portion of the video than necessary, so I'm going to do my best to condense this down and keep it on track this time. There's a lot of weird mechanics that make this work, but all you really need to know is that shiny Pokemon in Generation 2 are determined by their inherent stats. These are similar to IVs, but in this generation they were known as determinant values, or DVs, and unlike IVs they range from 0 to 15 instead of 31. And since certain DVs are passed down by breeding, if you start with a shiny Pokemon, you can pass down some of those shiny DVs to its offspring like an inherited gene. And Pokemon with this shiny gene have a 1 in 128 chance of creating a shiny offspring. This method does require you to start with a shiny Pokemon, but fortunately we're in Generation 2, meaning there's a free shiny Gyarados waiting for you in the Lake of Rage which will always be male, and by breeding with the right partners, you can pass its gene to Pokemon from every egg group except human-like, amorphous, and mineral. If you use a shiny Ditto as the parent, your odds are actually doubled to 1 in 64, and you can actually use your red Gyarados to get a shiny Ditto if you transfer it into Generation 1. In Red and Blue, if a wild Pokemon uses Transform while it is already transformed, it permanently changes its stats to that of the Pokemon that it's copying, and this can easily be achieved by teaching Mimic to a shiny Pokemon, and having it copy the move from a wild Ditto before it transforms. Once it does, the Ditto will then be able to transform again, and catching it will result in a shiny Ditto when it's traded up into Generation 2, since it copied the DVs of a shiny Pokemon. Assuming you can access the Pokemon that you want to hunt, this method allows you to get almost any shiny from Generations 1 and 2, as well as many cross-generational evolutions and even some regional forms by transferring them upwards. Breeding with the Ditto is also the only way to get eggs for exclusively male evolution lines, namely Tauros, Tyrogue, and Nidoking.
We black out and wake up in a sewer. You know what that means? Fish!
This next method is much easier to understand. By fishing repeatedly into a single spot in Generation 6, your chance of finding a shiny increases dramatically. Each consecutive Pokemon that you hook gets more and more rolls for being a shiny, up to 43 times per encounter with a shiny charm and a chain of over 20 hooks, giving you a little bit over a 1% chance per encounter for a shiny. There is a chance you can break the streak if nothing bites, but having a Pokemon with the ability Suction Cups at the front of your party will increase your chance of reeling something in, and if you find a place to fish that is surrounded on 3 sides, you are guaranteed an encounter every time you cast your rod. The Dynamax Lair is a sort of mini-game that was added into the Crown Tundra DLC for Sword and Shield. You play with up to 3 other people and travel a short maze of random Dynamax battles using rented Pokemon, before fighting a legendary at the very end. Anything you catch has a 1 in 300 chance of being a shiny, which increases to 1 in 100 with the shiny charm, but you can't see whether the Pokemon is shiny or not until the adventure ends. Each adventure will have you face 3 random Pokemon and then the legendary, and the adventure ends when you catch the legendary or run out of lives. You can choose only 1 Pokemon you caught to take with you, and if you take the legendary, you'll be unable to catch it again in the future. The assortment of Pokemon that can be found here is pretty varied, but it's not a reliable method of hunting anything since it's randomised each time, and other players get to vote on which way you travel. However, you can save the location of up to 3 legendary Pokemon, allowing you to choose which one you encounter when you set out on an adventure. In my opinion, the chance of finding a random shiny is more like an added bonus to keep you engaged while you're hunting for the legendary.
How does radar work?
The Poke Radar in X and Y and BDSP also has a similar shiny rate, but requires you to build up a chain of encounters before the odds max out at around 1%. It can be a fairly reliable way of shiny hunting, but breaking the chain means you have to start over. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire also has a similar function called the Dex Nav, and I tried wrapping my head around the shiny rates, but it feels very conditional and there's not a lot of information about it. To even get the best odds, it looks like you need to encounter your target 1,000 times, and even then your boosted chance is only for the 50th and 100th encounter, so it's hard to say if a 2% shiny chance is even worth it in this scenario. In Legends Arceus, mass outbreaks are one of the best ways to get shinies. While you can't control what spawns as a mass outbreak, they're fairly common and it's possible to re-roll them by coming and going from the village until you find one that you like. Assuming you have the shiny charm and a perfect research page for the Pokemon you're hunting, each Pokemon in a mass outbreak has a 1 in 128 chance of being a shiny. This method of hunting used to be extremely reliable, but as of the Daybreak update, the Pokemon you encounter from each outbreak is effectively fixed as soon as the outbreak spawns, meaning that if you clear an outbreak and then reload your save to try again, you'll be encountering the exact same Pokemon every time. You can cause slight variations based on whether you catch or defeat each Pokemon, but there's no guarantee you'll be able to find a shiny from an outbreak anymore.
What the dog doing?
This is going to be a pretty short section because there's only 1 Pokemon here, Poochyena. Since Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl were such faithful remakes, there's nothing available in Diamond and Pearl that can't be found in the remakes, and since the remakes use the increased shiny chance from Generation 6, using the radar in Diamond and Pearl leaves you with half the chance of a shiny. However, Poochyena can only be found using the radar in Pokemon Platinum, meaning its chance of being a shiny is only 1 in 200.
Where animals live and thrive, and there's an endangered species right there.
While the Daybreak update may have nerfed outbreak hunting, it also added a new form of outbreaks. Massive mass outbreaks have a lower shiny rate than mass outbreaks, but they have a chance to spawn stronger evolved Pokemon or alpha forms more frequently. Almost all of the Pokemon exclusive to massive mass outbreaks evolve from Pokemon you can find in regular mass outbreaks, with the exception of Unown, Spiritomb, and the starter trio. Cyndaquil isn't listed because it can already be hatched in Generation 2, and transferring a Quilava into Legends Arceus will allow you to evolve it into Hisuian Typhlosion. Similarly, Rowlet and Oshawott can also be evolved into their non-Hisuian counterparts outside of Legends Arceus. When a wild Pokemon in Alola is low on health, there's a chance it will summon another Pokemon to join the fight. Often this will be a member of the same species, but sometimes it will be a rival Pokemon or another similar Pokemon in the area. If you KO this Pokemon and use an Adrenaline Orb, the wild Pokemon can keep calling for more help. This is called SOS Chaining, and as more and more allies are summoned, the chance of one being a shiny also increases, capping out at around 1 in 270. Most wild Pokemon in Alola can call for help this way, meaning it's a good way for shiny hunting in Generation 7. However, there are a few exceptions, namely legendaries and island scan Pokemon, as well as a few special cases like Kamala and Minior.
Step off! Step off! Shit! They jumping me! They jumping me!
While SOS encounters have 2 Pokemon teaming up on you, on certain routes in Generation 6 you might be attacked by 5 wild Pokemon at once. This is known as a Horde Encounter, and it was a very popular method of shiny hunting in this generation. The Pokemon in these hordes have the same individual shiny rates as any other wild Pokemon, but Horde Encounters allow you to check 5 Pokemon at a time, meaning you're effectively 5 times more likely to see a shiny per encounter. Hordes normally only appear 5% of the time on compatible routes, but can be guaranteed by using honey or the move Sweet Scent. The only problem is that most routes have multiple hordes that you can encounter, with a specific horde only having around a 60% chance at best of appearing. With no way of controlling what horde you're going to see, your actual encounter odds are much lower, averaging a 3 times boost for most hordes with a 60% encounter rate. There's only one horde that has a 100% encounter rate and doesn't already have a hunting method with better odds on this list, and that would be Whismur, with its evolved forms already available in the Dynamax lair and by using the BDSP radar.
Brilliant. 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 Brilliant.
In Sword and Shield, Pokemon in the overworld or in fishing spots have a chance to spawn with this glowing yellow aura. These are called Brilliant Pokemon and have better IVs and random egg moves as well as a higher chance of being shiny. This chance increases the more times you've encountered that one type of Pokemon. After 500 encounters, the chance for a Brilliant Pokemon of that species to be shiny is 9 times higher than normal. However, Brilliant Pokemon only have a maximum 3% chance of spawning, and this shiny rate is only 0.02% higher than the Masuda Method. Since there isn't a reliable way of making Brilliant Pokemon spawn, and it requires you to battle 500 of each type you want to hunt, this isn't an ideal method of shiny hunting. But if you happen to see a Brilliant Pokemon in the wild, it's worth checking it out just in case. Even if it's not shiny, you'll get a few watts for defeating it. As well as expanding on the open world gameplay of Legends Arceus, Scarlet and Violet also kept the concept of Outbreaks. These Outbreaks work slightly differently and actually don't offer any increased shiny odds to begin with, but after clearing 30 Pokemon from the Outbreak, each Pokemon has a double chance of being shiny, and that chance is tripled after defeating 60. While the shiny rate is still lower than that of Outbreaks in Legends Arceus, you can still get a pretty high shiny rate when you combine it with Herba Mystica sandwiches. By adding the right ingredients, you can make sandwiches that increase the base shiny rate for a single type of Pokemon from 1 in 4096 to 1 in 1024, and this will stack with the shiny charm and the increased outbreak rate for a total shiny chance of 1 in 512. And unlike Legends Arceus, it is also possible to influence what outbreaks spawn, as encounters will change whenever the date changes, and by having an encounter power meal active when that happens, it will cause more outbreaks of that type to appear. Since shiny Pokemon can be seen in the overworld, you can check a lot of Pokemon very quickly in an outbreak, and you can freely re-roll all of the encounters in an outbreak by leaving the area or opening a picnic. The outbreak will disperse after you catch or defeat around 100 to 120 Pokemon, or if the date changes again. But you can preserve an outbreak for as long as you need by closing the game and turning the clock backwards to earlier in the day. One of the best features about outbreaks though is they make hunting for specific forms incredibly easy. If a Pokemon has multiple forms such as Flabebe or Deerling, all the Pokemon in a single outbreak will be of the exact same form. This even extends to Sinistea and Poltergeist, meaning that if you find an Antique Sinistea or Artisan Poltergeist outbreak, you can easily hunt for a shiny without the risk of phonies. Now we reach what is possibly the most well-known strategy, the Masuda Method. When breeding 2 Pokemon from different language regions, your chance of breeding a shiny is increased by up to 8 times while using the shiny charm. This method was added in Generation 4 and is named after Game Freak director Junichi Masuda, who revealed the existence of this technique in a blog post in 2007. It was put into the game to encourage people to use the new global trading system they had developed, and have been present in every main title since, with the exception of Let's Go and Legends Arceus, where breeding isn't possible. While this method has the same odds as hunting Outbreaks with shiny sandwiches, breeding doesn't require you to spend Herba Mystica, and allows you to make sure you're getting good IVs, guaranteed natures, and a high chance of your Pokemon having the right ability, as well as having the widest pool of available Pokemon that can be hunted with this method across multiple generations. Not to mention, this method requires the least concentration and the lowest risk. You can idly hatch multiple eggs at a time, and there's no risk of accidentally breaking a chain or running away from a wild shiny, meaning you can rack up encounters fairly quickly compared to methods like radar chaining or breeding in Generation 2, which takes much longer without the egg charm or abilities like Flame Body to speed up the rate of hatching. While almost every Pokemon can either be obtained in an Outbreak in Generation 9 or hunted with the Masuda Method in Generations 7 and 8, there is one group of Pokemon that are different, the Paradox Pokemon. This new category of Pokemon cannot lay eggs and are only found in Area 0, the only place where Outbreaks cannot appear. Fortunately, we can still make use of sandwiches to increase the shiny chance, and with the use of encounter power increasing the spawn rate for the same type of Pokemon, we can easily find Paradox Pokemon in large numbers and with decent shiny odds. Here we finally get to the hardest ones, the ones which have little to no way of increasing the odds. To start, these 7 legendaries can't be found in the Dynamax lair, meaning they do not benefit from the gracious 1% shiny chance, instead having to be hunted at full odds. Be warned that while all 7 of these can be found in the Crown Tundra, only Cobalion, Terrakion and Virizion benefit from the shiny charm. If you want the best odds for the Regis, you should look for them in the Ultra Wormhole or in the Hoenn remakes, where the shiny charm works for all of them. And for these Pokemon, the shiny charm is also entirely useless. While they are shiny locked in Galar, Type Null and Poipole can be hunted in Generation 7, but the shiny charm has no effect on gifted Pokemon. The same goes for the fossils in Galar, as they count as gifts when received from Kara. They can also be found in raid dens, but the shiny charm doesn't affect those either. And lastly, we have Regieleki, Regidrago, and Arceus. Similar to Regirock, Regice, and Registeel, the 2 Regis here are not affected by the shiny charm either, and as they debuted in Generation 8, there's currently nowhere else to hunt for them. While shiny locked in Legends Arceus, completing that game and going into the Generation 4 remakes allows you to battle Arceus again. This Arceus isn't shiny locked, but it's a very time consuming hunt, taking about a full minute for each reset. At last, we reach the final tier. Not only are these Pokemon full odds, they can only be hunted in Generations 2, 3 and 4, where the shiny odds are still 1 in 8,192. Despite these 3 being mythicals, you actually don't need any online events to access them. To start, Celebi can be encountered in the Virtual Console release of Pokemon Crystal. After beating the game, you can claim an event item that was given away for the original Pokemon Crystal, allowing you to encounter Celebi. The only problem is that since I last covered this topic, the Nintendo eShop has now shut down, meaning you can no longer buy Pokemon Crystal on the 3DS. If you have it downloaded already, you can still complete this hunt and transfer Celebi into Generation 7, but once Bank goes offline for good, it will be stuck in Generation 2. Next we have Jirachi. In America, there is the Wishmaker Jirachi that can be distributed using a special disc that came with Pokemon Colosseum. This Jirachi was supposedly meant to be shiny locked, but there are a set number of Jirachi that can be generated by this distribution, and people have discovered a select few of them that are shiny. To be precise, there are 65,376 unique Wishmaker Jirachis, and 9 of them are shiny, meaning this distribution actually has a 1 in 7,264 chance of being shiny. However, you can only redeem 1 Jirachi per save file, so each attempt for a new Jirachi will require you to start a new game and play up until you receive the Pokédex. Meanwhile, the Pokemon Channel game in the UK and Australia had the ability to give out Jirachi as well. This one is believed to have the usual odds of being shiny, and to redeem this gift you have to have beaten the game and entered the Hall of Fame, meaning each attempt at a Channel Jirachi will take at least a few hours, even with a world record pace. And finally, we have Manaphy. In the Pokemon Ranger series, you can download a special post-game mission and then send a Manaphy egg to your Generation 4 save file. While Shadows of Almia and Guardian Signs required you to download this mission during a limited time window, the original Pokemon Ranger had this mission pre-downloaded, and only required a special password to unlock it, meaning you can still get this egg today. Just like Wishmaker Jirachi, this Manaphy is supposed to be shiny locked. However, since it is generated as an egg, in this case it is possible to bypass the shiny lock. Starting in Generation 3, every Pokemon has a unique personality value. When you encounter a wild Pokemon or hatch an egg, this value is compared to your trainer information by using a specific calculation, which generates a number between 0 and 65,536. If this number is between 0 and 7, or between 0 and 15 since Generation 6, then the Pokemon will become a shiny. When generating the Manaphy egg, the game will look at your trainer information, and if it generates a personality value that would result in Manaphy being a shiny, it will roll that number again until it generates one that won't be. This value cannot be changed once the egg is generated. but an egg doesn't have a trainer ID assigned to it until it hatches, which means if Manaphy is traded to a different save file with different trainer information, that calculation will now produce a different number, and one that could result in it hatching as a shiny. Similar to Jirachi, this means a tedious hunt that requires generating a new save file for each attempt, then trading the egg over, hatching it to shiny check, and then resetting and trading to a new game if it's not. Now, last time I did this list, I got a lot of comments pointing out that the odds per encounter doesn't necessarily mean that one method of hunting is better than the other. And while that wasn't the purpose of my original video, it did make me wonder if there was an easy way to use this data to work out which of these methods would be faster for shiny hunting. And after a bit of thinking, I had an idea. Since I have the odds for all of these hunting methods, I can simply work out how long the average encounter takes, and then extrapolate that to work out how long it would take for you to reach the shiny odds. So for example, if I figure out how long it takes to do 512 Outbreak encounters, or how long it takes to do 270 SOS encounters, that would give me the average time it would take to find a shiny, and I can directly compare these times to work out which is faster. To start with, I decided to dive into the Ultra Wormhole. While all of my calculations have been assuming the best case scenarios, in practice some of these hunts have a lot more variables that will affect your odds. In the case of the Ultra Warp Ride, there are 4 types of wormholes, indicated by the intensity of the glowing aura, and each one has its own effect on the shiny chance. The max shiny chance is reached after travelling at least 5,000 light years, which takes roughly 2.5 minutes depending on how much speed you manage to build up. Assuming you're able to reach that distance and enter the rarest type of wormhole every time, it would take you around 7 minutes to reach the shiny odds, or 12 minutes if you settle for the second best wormhole. While travelling through one of these wormholes, I also stumbled across a legendary that I hadn't caught yet, which gave me the perfect opportunity to try out some soft resetting. The biggest variable for this method is going to be what you're resetting for and what game you're doing it in. I was able to reset this Yuxi very quickly, and I could have easily seen around 200 an hour, which would take me 390 minutes to reach odds with the shiny charm. However, some resets require you to go through dialogue or cutscenes before each encounter, such as when you choose a starter Pokemon or encounter certain legendaries. When I was hunting for Arceus in Brilliant Diamond, the game's loading times after each reset and the cutscene that happens before the battle added up to an entire minute between each encounter, meaning that hunt would take you over 68 hours to reach 4,096 encounters. SOS chaining also ended up being fairly quick. Each turn in battle only takes about 20 seconds if you disable move animations, and most turns would end with another Pokemon being called into battle. The chance of an ally being called is also dependent on a lot of factors. Each species of Pokemon has its own call rate that determines how often and how successful they are at calling allies, and some species have a call rate high enough to guarantee a new ally every turn if done correctly. Using an Adrenaline Orb, keeping the Pokemon under 20% health, and having a Pokemon with Intimidate, Pressure or Unnerve will give you the best chance for more allies to keep appearing. Under these conditions, you could reach odds on this hunt in around 90 minutes, or 100 if you factor in the 30 KOs required to reach maximum shiny odds. Then I moved into X and Y to try chain fishing, and this one was surprisingly fast as well. Unlike radar chains, you can keep your streak simply by running away from an encounter, instead of having to battle it or catch it, and you can even fish up a different Pokemon without breaking your chain. The chain only ends if you leave the area or fail to reel in anything at all, and by fishing in an area like this that's blocked in on all sides, you'll find a fish every time you cast your rod. I was encountering a Pokemon roughly every 22 seconds, so it only takes 7.5 minutes for your chain to have the maximum shiny chance, and then another 36 minutes to reach 95 encounters. The only downside is that the timing can be quite precise, and if you're too slow to react when something bites, you'll have to start over. After that, I moved on to Horde Encounters. By having a Pokemon with Sweet Scent in my party, I could encounter a Horde whenever I wanted, which made it very easy to figure out how long this hunt would take. Each encounter took 28 seconds, and there were no variables that would affect this timing, so it would take just over 2 hours to see 273 Hordes. For my last method in Generation 6, I went with radar chaining. This method requires you to either catch or KO the Pokemon you encounter in order to keep the chain going, but without the additional loading time of spawning 5 Pokemon at once, or the menu navigation for using Sweet Scent, these encounters were actually slightly faster, taking only 26 seconds to KO each one and move on to the next. However, you need a chain of 40 before your shiny odds are at their maximum, and building up a successful radar chain is more luck than skill. There are ways to improve your odds, but you are entirely at risk of the chain simply ending through no fault of your own, either by running into a different species, or the game simply deciding to not give you any more encounters. But assuming you can maintain a chain indefinitely, you would reach 40 encounters in around 17 minutes, and by then it would only take you another 10 minutes to reach full odds. While the individual chance for a shiny Pokemon to appear is around 1 in 100, each time you activate the radar it shows you up to 4 patches of grass, which will sparkle to indicate if there's a shiny, so a chance of seeing a shiny each time the radar is activated is closer to 1 in 25, but this rate is incredibly optimistic given how easy it is for a chain to end. As for radar chaining in Generation 4, the time it took for each encounter was slightly longer, averaging around 30 seconds for each battle, meaning this method would take 20 minutes to reach 40 encounters, and then accounting for the lower shiny rate, it would take another 25 minutes for you to check 200 patches of grass. Moving onward into Pokemon Violet, I decided to investigate an outbreak of Smeargle. In order to maximise your odds, you first need to KO 60 Pokemon. This can be done very quickly in auto battle mode or by synchronising with your partner if you're hunting in the terrarium. After this initial setup, you're free to come and go from the outbreak as you like. There's no chain that needs to be maintained, and the outbreak will keep these increased odds until it despawns. The wild Pokemon will disappear whenever you start a picnic, so starting and then leaving one is a very fast way to re-roll the visible encounters to check for shinies. I was able to count around 13 Smeargles a minute, and for the sake of experimenting, I decided to do another count using an encounter power sandwich. The second time I saw around 15 per minute, so I don't believe encounter power has a significant effect on the density of outbreaks. So if you're planning to use a sandwich to maximise your shiny chance, it might be better to make one with Humongo or Teensy power, for a chance at a shiny with the maximum or minimum size possible. The number of encounters you see at a time will likely depend on how much open space there is for Pokemon to spawn, but hunting an outbreak with a sparkling sandwich should put you at odds in around 36 minutes, although each sandwich only lasts for 30, so it would be smart to save your game before making it, and then you can reload to get your rare herbs back if you don't catch anything. And just as I was about to reset after comparing the spawn rates, I happened to find a shiny Smeargle. As I still had 20 minutes left on the normal power sandwich I just made, I decided to head to the early areas of the game to check the rate for hunting with just sparkling power and encounter power. The wild spawns were still quite varied, but there was a decent amount of Lechonks, Fletchlings and Azurill being drawn in by the encounter power, and I averaged 25 normal types a minute while speeding around on Miraidon, which would put you at odds in 27 minutes. There was still quite a lot of other random Pokemon around however, and I wanted to see if I could improve these numbers and narrow down the encounters to a single target. So I made a water encounter sandwich and headed into Area 0 to look for Iron Bundle, and the difference in spawn rates was very noticeable. The entire cave area was nothing but Iron Bundle, and I was seeing as many as 40 per minute, which would take you only 17 minutes to reach odds with. I decided to hunt for the full duration of the sandwich, and found not one but 2 shinies before it ran out. Masuda Method was next on my list, and is a method I've done multiple hunts with in the past. In this generation there is no daycare, but instead you get eggs by placing compatible Pokemon in your party and then hosting a picnic. Eggs will appear in the basket periodically, but this rate can be sped up by using meals that grant egg power. The speed at which you can hatch eggs depends on what species you're hatching though, as each species requires a different number of egg cycles before it will hatch. An egg cycle happens every time you take a certain number of steps, either around 255 or 128 depending on what game you're playing, and factors like egg power and having a Pokemon with flame body or magma armor will reduce how many steps you need to hatch an egg. Most Pokemon require between 10 and 40 egg cycles to hatch, so I use Fuecoco, as starter Pokemon fall in the middle of that range with 20, although Magikarp eggs would be the fastest of all, as they only need 5. Combining egg power and a sandwich with flame body, I was able to hatch a Fuecoco egg in 32 seconds, and a party full of eggs in 2.5 minutes. Although this doesn't take into account the time it would take to gather more eggs, as you would need to rehost the picnic and put the breeding pair back into your party to wait for more to appear. To see if it would be faster, I moved into Sword and Shield. Here I was able to pick up eggs while cycling around to hatch the ones already in my party, and hatching a Torchic took me 1 minute and 37 seconds while stopping to pick up more eggs at the same time. However, the 4 after it each hatched immediately after I took another step, and I already had 5 more eggs ready to swap into my party once they were done hatching, meaning I could continually be hatching 5 eggs every 3.5 minutes, averaging 1 egg every 42 seconds, and putting me at odds within 358 minutes. While cycling around in the wild area, I took some time to look for brilliant Pokemon to work out how fast I could hunt them, but in 10 minutes of searching, I only saw a total of 3. Granted, the rate at which they spawn is influenced by how many times you've encountered that species, but the difference between 1 encounter and 500 encounters would only double the chance of brilliant spawns from 1.5% to 3%. So even if I encountered every Pokemon 500 times, that would still put my brilliant encounter rate at only around 3 every 5 minutes. And it would take 760 minutes to reach odds with this method, although this was with simply checking any brilliant Pokemon that appeared, and without any influence over which ones you see, meaning this is still far from an optimal way of hunting a specific target. For my last stop in Galar, I looked at the Dynamax lair. As I mentioned in the main tier list, this method isn't optimal for hunting any specific Pokemon aside from the legendaries, as there are a wide number of possible encounters that are all randomised for each adventure. In my experience, the average adventure takes around 15 minutes, assuming you make it to the end and defeat the legendary each time. At this rate, you're actually looking at 1,500 minutes to reach odds on the legendary encounter, but if you don't really care what shiny you see, you would average a shiny in 375 minutes, with a 1 in 4 chance of it being the legendary. Heading into Hisui, I took a quick look at Outbreaks, heading first to one of the massive mass outbreaks. I fought 2 waves of Hisui and Zoroark and Zoroark, totaling 15 encounters in 3.5 minutes before it dried up. This might have been faster if all the Zoroark had stayed in the balls and hadn't required me to battle them. And in comparison, I went to a regular mass outbreak of Kricketune, and after stopping to catch the shiny that immediately spawned, I cleared the rest of the outbreak of 14 Kricketune in only 1 minute and 20 seconds. Assuming you can clear each outbreak as fast as possible by spamming Pokeballs, you would average a shiny every 19 minutes in massive mass outbreaks, and every 12 minutes in mass outbreaks. Although this doesn't account for the time it would take you to find a new outbreak of the same species after it disperses, or the time it would take you to methodically go through different combinations of catching and defeating Pokemon to check every possible spawn for a shiny. And for our final method, I tried hatching eggs in Generation 2. While the shiny rate is still relatively high, it's held back by the actual process of breeding and hatching eggs being incredibly slow in comparison to modern generations. While I was able to hatch a Fuecoco egg in only 30 seconds, hatching a single Magikarp egg took me almost 3 minutes, despite having a much lower egg cycle. This is compounded by the relatively slower movement in Generation 2, meaning each step in an egg cycle takes longer, and there is no method of improving the hatch rate, since abilities didn't exist in Generation 2. Taking into account that this is the fastest type of egg you can hatch, you might be looking at 10 minutes of constant cycling to hatch a Pokemon like Charmander, or even 20 for Pokemon like Lapras, Snorlax, and Dratini. The rate at which eggs appear in the daycare isn't much better either. After I'd hatched the Magikarp egg, I had to cycle for another minute before I could receive a second egg from the daycare man, bringing this Magikarp hunt to 4 minutes per egg, which would mean 4 hours before I reached full odds, and averaging 16 hours for most other Pokemon with longer egg cycles. The odd egg in Crystal needs 20 cycles to hatch, but your chance of seeing a shiny is around 1 in 7 if you don't care which one you see, and hunting for a specific target would range from 1 in 33 for Cleffa and Igglybuff, 1 in 50 for Magby, Elekid and Smoochum, or 1 in 100 for Tyrogue and Pichu. With all of these factors taken into account, it seems that the Ultra Wormhole is still the fastest, with Dynamax Adventures being deceptively slow for legendary hunting despite the 1% shiny chance. With these numbers, we can also directly compare the average time it would take to hunt an individual Pokemon across different methods. For example, hatching a shiny Caterpie in Generation 2 would take an average of 768 minutes, due to its egg cycle being 3 times longer than Magikarp, whereas in the same time frame you could find 7 shiny Caterpie from SOS Chaining. Or in the time it would take you to find a shiny legendary in the Dynamax lair, I might have instead found 4 shiny legendaries or Ultra Beasts from soft resetting in the Ultra Wormhole. Again, some of these tiers such as Outbreaks and Radar Chains are very optimistic, and the time I got for sandwich hunting assumes you're able to isolate a single species to be spawning a majority of the time, which is only possible in certain areas such as Area 0 with paradoxes. Of course, when it comes to the tier list, I can't just reorder all of the tiers on this list as is to reflect this new data. In order for this to be fully accurate, I'd have to redo the whole thing. This took 2.5 hours. Merry Christmas.
That was brilliant, Candle Meat. Very much enjoyed